Where are women in times of war? Women at War and Its Aftermath is a new podcast where we explore the stories of women who fight and mobilize for what they believe in. What does it mean to be an agent in war or in peace? How might women's activism and involvement in politics take many forms? The first series focuses on stories of women in the Maoist People's War in Nepal. My name is Hanna Ketola and I'm a researcher based in London, originally from Finland.
Hi, I'm Swastika Kosoju and I'm also currently based in London, working as a consultant in international development. I originally come from Nepal.
We have fought for the party for 10 years. We have become injured and disabled. Our children were also born there. We are still hopeful towards the party. The only thing is that we are still looking, watching, and observing who will raise the issues, who is going to organize everyone together. We are going to follow that leader.
Welcome to our 5th episode, which continues the stories of women who fought in the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. In this episode, we meet Renuka, who was a platoon commander during the war. We will hear her story as she talks about her continuous dedication to the revolutionary struggle and her refusal to contribute to party activities in the post-war context. We will also hear more from Sarika and Anar, whom you have met in episode 4. We delve deeper into what is at stake when ex-fighters appear to be moving away from party activities and the public sphere. Could this be an expression of political agency?
I met the women ex-PLA fighters at a very particular time. In 2013, it was only a year since they had left the PLA cantonments set up in 2006 as part of the peace process. The women had entered the cantonments and gone through the UN-led process of verifying combatants. This was a supposedly technical exercise to decide who qualified as a combatant based on age and the time the person had joined the PLA. The cantonments were supposed to be a temporary measure. But the process of verifying combatants and the wider question of what to do with the two standing armies, the PLA and the then Royal Nepal Army, became highly contested. The conflict had ended in a stalemate. After the peace agreement, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist had gained a major victory in the 2008 elections and turned from a fringe party to a deciding player in Nepal's political field. The CPNM rejected the framing of the question of the two armies as one of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR. This would have been the framing commonly used in post-conflict situations, as DDR processes form a crucial part of the international peacebuilding paradigm. Instead, the Maoist Party saw this as a case of army integration. So instead of reintegrating former Maoist ex-combatants back to the society, so to speak, the former combatants would have been integrated in large numbers to the Nepal army. Due to the power struggle between the political parties and the contested nature of this question of army integration, the cantonment of the PLA continued for nearly 7 years. Upon leaving the cantonments, the women I met had taken voluntary retirement, that is, a cash package, and had started rebuilding their lives, often in a completely new location, rather than returning to the remote rural districts from where they had first joined the movement. And in the end, only 1,421 ex-combatants were actually integrated to the Nepal army, out of the 19,600 verified by the UN mission. The anger, frustration, and disappointment felt towards the party and the leaders about how the army integration process had been handled and how the ex-PLA fighters, like them, had not been provided for and instead been ignored or discarded, were the underlying theme in every informal conversation or interview I had with these women.
2013 would have been such an interesting time to do this research and to meet these women. Regarding the peace process and the post-conflict reconstruction efforts, I wanted to say a little bit about the NGO-based advocacy work that was going on around the women, peace and security agenda. This agenda, originally introduced as a result of the UN Resolution 1325 back in 2000, was in novel ways employed by the women's NGOs and activists in Nepal already during the conflict. After the peace agreement, the international donors got increasingly involved and supported the creation of a national action plan for implementing the women, peace, and security agenda. The reason I say this is that this NGO based activism was geared towards making peace building efforts, including policies and programs targeted to ex combatants, gender sensitive, and enhancing the participation of women at all levels of peace building. Now, I wonder whether in your research, Hannah, you dealt with this agenda in relation to the ex-PLA fighters. Was this agenda in any ways important? What do you think?
Thanks for bringing this up. What struck me in the interviews with the NGOs closely involved with the National Action Plan was how no one was able to point out specific programs targeted at female ex-combatants. In interviews, a curious construct emerged. In the action plan, former women combatants was distinguished as a separate target group and subsumed under the general category of conflict-affected women. And what I argue is that this contradiction was enabled by and consolidated a narrative of return. By that, I mean that there was this story, this presumption that women who had fought in the PLA would, in the post conflict context, be affected by what seemed to be an inevitable backlash of stigmatization and strengthening of societal gender norms. That what would happen, or was already happening, to these female ex fighters was a return to the kitchen, to the gender roles that supposedly had been the norm prior to the conflict. Rather than having a stake in political processes such as army integration, the women ex-fighters were positioned as merely affected by the policies of the Maoist party. And the task of the NGOs then and the international community was to devise gender-sensitive policies to assist them. I mention this here because the women ex-fighters I met, including Anna, Renuka, and Sarika, strongly rejected this narrative of return. This story about how they had been merely affected by the conflict rather than actively contributed to the struggle, or how in the aftermath of the armed struggle they had been disempowered, become passive, or lost their agency.
So, if this narrative was rejected, what might be the alternative stories? Hannah met Renuka when conducting interviews in Bake. At the time, Renuka was running a small hotel with her husband, who had also fought in the PLA, and they had two young children. Renuka was originally from Humla, a remote hill district that became a Maoist stronghold during the war. She had become involved in the Maoist movement through working for the Women's Front in her village, becoming a full-timer at the age of 16. She had been a village council member, taking on considerable responsibilities as a party worker before joining the PLA. Based on their first conversation, it appeared that Renuka had no expectations from the party leaders and envisioned few avenues to continue being involved in politics despite her long contribution to the struggle.
उनीहरूले धेरै तालिमहरू गरे हामीहरूलाई धेरै कामहरू गर्न लगाए तर अहिले they conducted so many trainings then they made us work hard but now neither government cares for us nor the party those who should have passed failed they made us work hard but now neither government cares for us nor the party they made us run for nothing all good happened to Prachanda the party workers got nothing I have just a right to vote that's it. That is the support I can give to the party.
I met with Renuka again, and these conversations complicated the picture. Our meeting took place in December 2013, a week after the second Constituent Assembly elections were held. Nepali Congress had gained a clear victory, and the Maoist party, now called UCPNM, had suffered significant losses. This time, we met in a small restaurant run by Renuka's friend, Rupa, who also had fought in the PLA, and the conversation was more informal. When the conversation turned to elections, Renuka started to share more about her relationship to the party and to the leaders, such as Prachanda, whom she had mentioned in the first meeting.
म सङ्गठन त छाड्दैन किन पार्टी नै यो मेरो लागि हो I will never leave this party and join some other party. If my parents go after the Nepali Congress, I will not go after them. I will not go to any other place either. No matter how badly corrupt they are, no matter how many lies they tell us, the party is our party. After all, we have fought for the party for 10 years. We have become injured and disabled. Our children were also born there. We are still hopeful towards the party. The only thing is that we are still looking, watching, and observing which politician will do that. Who will raise the issues that were of concerns yesterday? Who is going to organize everyone together? We are going to follow that leader. We are not going to leave it. We have to fight for justice. We have our thoughts and faith in the party. We have not killed the country as of yet. Yesterday, we fought for the country. Now, it's our time to see what they will do. We have already brought changes according to our capacity. Now, we need to see what they will do. We need to get our rights. We will see what they do, and then our results will come later.
Through this narrative, which was passionately delivered as a long, uninterrupted speech, Renuka not only emphasized the contribution she and other PLA fighters had made, saying, "We have already brought changes according to our capacity," but also connected this contribution with her ability to evaluate the current leadership. The key here is Renuka's statement that she was waiting to see what the leaders will do. By the time of our second meeting, this waiting had translated into concrete practices through which Renuka was withdrawing her support, including by refusing to participate in party activities to secure votes in her home district.
मेरो एकजना चिनेको दाइ पार्टीको उम्मेदवार हुनुहुन्थ्यो अनि उहाँले एक दिन मलाई गाउँमा चुनावको कार्यक्रमको लागि बोलाउनु भयो. One of my brothers was a candidate for the party. He called me and invited me to the village for election activities. I asked him politely to send me money so that I could cover the travel cost from Kohalpur to Humla. I also told him that this is not only a matter of my vote, it concerns votes of other 100 to 150 people as well. But he did not follow up. Now there is a surge of new cadres. They have encircled the leadership from all sides. But no one matches the loyalty and the spirit of the original, seasoned cadres. The newcomers would go around for 2 or 3 days, chant slogans. My brother rang me again 2 days ago. He complained that the party's candidate from the direct representation category lost because we had become passive.
In contrast to the first interview, where Renuka declared with frustration that "I have just the right to vote," in the second conversation, she represented herself as a seasoned cadre who could not only support the party by giving her own vote, but indeed by utilizing her capacities to mobilize others. And it is this form of contribution that Renuka had refused to give. She explains further why she had decided not to go.
अनि मुख्यतः आफू पार्टीमा सक्रिय हुनको लागि आर्थिक सहयोग चाहिन्छ. For us to get involved in the party, we need a lot of economic support. If I have to go for a month or two to campaign for my party, who will give me economic support? The party is not going to give it. I have to pay rent for the house I live in. If my hotel does not work for 10 days, then I will have a loss. They would ask us to use our own money and say they would arrange the budget later. Then they would say that no one paid for the transport. So we have to manage that ourselves. Now we cannot sit like beggars hoping that someone or other will support us. So because of that, I think it's better not to go at all.
Importantly, the party providing or not providing financial support is in Renuka's story invested with meaning that goes beyond the practicalities of being able to sustain her family's livelihood. It becomes connected with her potential contribution not being valued and with her not being treated with the respect she deserves as a seasoned cadre. We cannot sit like beggars. I was struck by the way in which Renuka not only narrated her capacity to mobilize others, but also performed elements of it, delivering long uninterrupted speeches in a manner perhaps not dissimilar to how she would have spoken if convincing people to vote. After the interview, Pramila and I discussed how Renuka had spoken so strongly. To us, this speaking strongly manifested in the ways Renuka was holding her body upright, meeting our eyes, and in her effortless comment of the Maoist rhetoric. She delivered a speech and made us listen. If read through the narrative of return, Renuka's story would appear as one where her wartime contribution goes unrecognized. the party does not value her as a seasoned cadre. Rather than foregrounding this lack of recognition and reading it as a denial of women's wartime agency, what I argue is that Renuka's reflections about her relationship to the party tell a more complex story. The capacities Renuka has crafted during the war that she talks about and performs are not simply shaken off when they go unrecognized. Rather, what Renuka does through her withdrawal is to refuse to employ her capacity to mobilize others until the conditions are right. And through this withdrawal, she retains the integrity of her commitment to the struggle. What I suggest is that Renuka's acts of refusal not only draws on embodied capacities cultivated during the war, but also performs important work in the formation of the ex-PLA subjectivity as one that is characterized by continuing loyalty to the struggle and pursuit in relation to the leaders.
I think that the context of economic scarcity is so crucial here. In 2013, Renuka and many of the other women fighters who had only recently left the cantonments were still trying to establish themselves and their families. They were trying to pay rent, trying to find a source of income, and so gaining any type of skilled employment would have been incredibly difficult, especially as they had left school to join the movement without finishing their SLC exams. And SLC exams is considered to be the iron gate to entering the path for a secure future in Nepal. I mean, when I think about it, even today, taking your SLC exams and passing them is a moment celebrated by the Nepali community all over Nepal. Family have feasts, celebrations if someone passes the exams. So for them to not have completed that, they're already in a disadvantaged group, education wise. Also, I remember, Hannah, you mentioned that almost all the women you had met had young children. I also wanted to discuss a little bit more about the kinds of constraints the women might have had which held them back from continued political involvement. Were they primarily responsible for taking care of their children? And were these responsibilities a hindrance on their ability to participate in party activities? I mean, some of the women who were actively leading the movement in the time of war have shared that they gave birth to their children while they were still actively participating in the movement, whilst they were still fighting the war. And then, post conflict, how did they go back to just fulfilling family or childcare responsibilities and not be politically active? If they could still manage to fight the war while having children, what was preventing them towards being politically involved or active in the post-war context?
This is such an important question about the constraints on political involvement and one that keeps haunting me. In the beginning of the fieldwork, I asked direct questions about the possible connection between childcare responsibilities and women's decreasing involvement in party activities, and I encouraged Pramila to do the same. I think this was because I found it hard to let go of my original image of women ex-fighters who continued to be involved in political mobilization and wanted a clear explanation for why they were not involved. So, in the first meeting with Sarika and the others in Navalparasi, which we discussed in episode 4, we did pose such questions. And Sarika confronted our leading questions with clear annoyance. How is it for women to be involved in party activities?
पर्यो भने त हामी जे पनि गर्न तयार छौं सबैसँग मिलेर काम गर्न तयार If required we can do anything work along with anyone while being in the cantonments we did everything equal even now if required we can do it
There are children with you. Will that not make things more difficult?
हामीलाई कसैले पनि रोक्न सक्दैन अब युद्धको बेलामा पनि हामीले दुईवटा बच्चाहरू बोकेर एउटा काँधमा बन्द Nothing can stop us When there was a war we used to carry two children along with rifle and bag one child in front and one child in the back we can work in any situation we have example of going on fightings when we were pregnant and giving birth to children now children have grown up we can be better fighters now
As Sarika's comments, we can be better fighters now, illustrate. The women I met were aware of the narrative of return, the story that labeled them as returning to the domestic sphere. No matter how much they had contributed during the war, it was already decided amongst peace-building actors and the leadership of the party that what women were doing after the armed struggle was a manifestation of a return, specifically a manifestation of a shift towards passivity and loss of agency. In other interviews, our questions about non-involvement in party activities prompted a similar emphasis on continuing capacities to undertake demanding tasks, often with emphasis on physical strength. For example, several women stressed that women did push-ups as part of the training regime in the cantonments. In this way, Sarika and others invoked the physical strength cultivated during war to counter our questions and the narrative of return that the peace-building discourses produce. They rejected the way they were positioned as women to have lost their agency, the capacities to fight and bring change they had cultivated during the war in the post-war context.
This is a very important point you have mentioned there, Hannah. The return and the loss of agency is something that is very intersectional and interlinked when we look at women's participation in war and conflict. Women are considered to be an active agent of change when it comes to bringing about political and social change or revolution, if I may call it that. Women, most of the time, also lead the movements in numbers through their active participation. But why is it that all of a sudden, after the movement or the war, women tend to return to their socially expected responsibilities of childcare or looking after the family? Is it because of the deeply rooted patriarchal concept that women are the only and primary carers of the family? I mean, men also do return from war, but it's always easier for them to become and remain politically active without having to bring changes or adjusting their lives. A simple example would be equal opportunities for education and employment. If in a household both the man and woman have a job, they both go to work all day. But when they return from the workplace, it is always the women who cook, feed, and take care of the family and the children, which is still not considered work, but rather as a female duty or responsibility. So there's always an uneven share of workload. So when they try to participate in politics, women are already in a disadvantaged position because of the time management constraints. I think this is a basic example of how this shift towards passivity or loss of agency occurs.
Yes, that is indeed the story that gets told over and over again. And there is truth in this. But I think it's crucially important to note that both Sarika and Renuka did not agree with this story. Their reflections about what it meant to be an ex-PLA fighter were much more nuanced than that. What struck me was how, through her responses, Sarika contested the narrative of return, the story about loss of agency and reinstating of social gender norms. Instead, she emphasized the capacities they had built through fighting and how these were retained also in the war's aftermath. I think, to me, the question is more about how these capacities are employed differently in the post-war context. For example, Renuka employed these capacities in her negotiation with the party.
Interesting. I think I can see what you mean now. I wonder whether we also need to think more about the meaning and role of politics here. Where is politics situated when the armed struggle is no longer going on? How does this shift from the time of war? I know you were asking questions about involvement in politics, but how did the women ex fighters themselves view politics during and after the war? What did it involve for them at the time?
To me, your question goes to the very core of these stories. In response, I would like us to listen to Anna's reflections around this question of what politics involves in the post-war context. I first met Anar in a gathering in Naval Barassi, and in our first meeting, Anar expressed that she was tired of politics and had no plans to be involved in the movement full-time again. Later, I met Anar again, and she invited Pramila and me to her home. When we were sitting outside her house and talking and eating popped corn that Anar had prepared, her husband joined us and brought a framed photo of Anar and himself in PLA uniforms, explaining that it had been taken on the day of their marriage ceremony. When seeing the photo her husband was holding, Anar laughed a little bit and then told us how her husband was still very active in politics and was working towards starting a new party with other ex-PLA members in the district. Later, when we were sitting inside and conducting a follow up interview, I asked Anar to tell us more about why she had said in the first meeting that she was tired of politics and what this meant when her husband was still so active. Anna responded by explaining how getting involved or not getting involved in politics happened according to the situation, describing her own journey in and out of politics in one long story. The first part of her story, where she describes getting involved in the Maoist movement, we already heard in episode 4. In this part of the story, Anna equated politics with armed struggle. But towards the end of her story, Anna elaborated on her husband's continuing involvement and her own decision not to get involved, invoking the temporality of the current situation. In this context, the meaning and location of politics had shifted.
अहिलेको स्थितिमा के हो भने राजनीति गरियो तर आखिर केही पाइएन and in the current situation we think that we did get involved in politics but nothing good came out of it. It has spoiled our lives. My husband thinks that we need to be involved in politics. After all, we have spent so much time and effort in yesterday's war, and how can we just leave it like that and stay home? Life itself is politics. But I disagree and always tell him to leave politics. I don't think we have a future in politics. Personally, I'm tired of politics, although my husband is not yet. He has this strong will of getting into politics and has a dream of doing something in the political sector. For me, in comparison to politics, I choose business and entrepreneurship and take care of my family. That is my opinion.
Anna positions herself as someone who has fought, who got involved in politics, and whose life was spoiled by it. And it is in relation to this grievance that she weighs her decision not to pursue efforts to get into politics. The withdrawal from the public sphere could be positioned as a demonstrative of agency, because the women chose so. Indeed, Anna finishes her story by emphasizing the autonomy exercised in her decision. She says, I chose business and entrepreneurship and taking care of my family. That is my opinion. But I think this reading is unsatisfying as it reduces the question of agency into one of a degree, that is, relative freedom from effective coercion. And it says so little about what is at stake in the withdrawal. What is at stake for Anar? To engage with such nuances, we need to examine how Anar and the other women ex-fighters interpret the locations that politics takes on in the post-conflict context. From Anar's narrative, politics in the current context emerges no longer only as a struggle, but also as a distinct sector, as something that her husband is trying to get into, and Anar contrasts with business, entrepreneurship, and taking care of my family. To me, Anar's reflections highlight how the prioritization of responsibilities towards the family and the weighing of these against continuing involvement in party activities is a negotiation. And it's a negotiation that cannot be reduced to the reinstating of societal gender norms. The complexity is revealed in the picture of politics shifting from armed struggle to a sector that is hard to reach, or a career that is hard to attain. Importantly, this attaining is conditioned by, but not reducible to gendered hierarchies. Because according to Anar, her husband would also struggle to have a future in politics.
These are some interesting points you have put forward, Hannah. And I think it's important to point out here the context in which you met Anar and the other women ex-fighters. Anar's decision to not get involved should be located in a context in which the Maoist Party, then UCP&M, had become well established in parliamentary politics. Many high-level PLA commanders, including women, were successfully pursuing a political career. But the women you had met, who were the foot soldiers or low-level commanders and who were more rurally based, or at least not Kathmandu based, had not moved with this shift, or probably they didn't at all get the opportunity to.
Exactly. And what I found so interesting was how they positioned the women who had gone into politics as part of the group of leaders whose conduct they severely scrutinized, as we heard in Renuka's story. In this episode, we wanted to offer alternative readings to the narrative of return, to the story that what women ex-fighters do in a post-conflict context necessarily constitutes a return to the kitchen, a reinstating of societal gender norms. I am concerned that when confronted by expressions such as "I am tired of politics," feminist scholarly analysis still too often holds on to the narrative of return. As a result, not very much new enters the picture, and instead we risk perpetuating precisely the kind of gendering that the women I met vehemently rejected. In the next episode, we will add more layers to the story by including perspectives of the so-called women leaders whose conduct the women I met were often critical of. Who are the women leaders? Did they identify as leaders? And how were they engaged in politics in the post-conflict context?
This is Women at War and Its Aftermath, a podcast about the untold stories of women who fight and mobilise for what they believe in. The podcast is co-hosted by Swasti Kakazaju and Hannah Kettler and co-produced and co-edited with Lizzie Ellen Aisha Khan. The voices for the stories are provided by Ankita Manadur, Divya Tapamagar, Manita Shrestha and Abhishek Shrestha. This podcast series was made possible by funding from the Economic and Social Science Research Council and King's College London. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate and review us on your preferred podcast provider. It really helps us reach more listeners with our inspiring stories of women at war.